To the curious, the seekers, and the experts, welcome. You're listening to Poli-Psych podcast. Schools are closed, businesses are shutting down, and people are being encouraged to remain in their homes. There's talk of a global financial reset, which will probably be required in order to restart the economy. So this is probably a good time for a societal and personal reset. Most of us are living in a biological and electronic soup. As we're given time to take stock and reevaluate, might we find some better ways to live, more rewarding, healthier, more natural, and yes, even more sustainable? We kicked around some ideas about those things, which we hope you will now enjoy.
Now, Ken, I thought you were headed in a direction to make an interesting point that you made earlier before we started the show about indoors and air conditioning being possibly circulating the virus around, and that is something that people might want to take into consideration if you are. And one thing that might be a good reason to stay home, because if you're all breathing the same air in an office building, you don't want to have sick people breathing their germs, whatever they might be, into that environment. And there is the possibility that you could be infected with a virus, a cold, whatever, for days before you have symptoms. So if you've been in contact with anybody, I'm not a doctor, don't play one on anything, but if I were you, I would stay home if you've been in contact with anybody that's been sick. So this national emergency gives us the grounds to do that, and in general, that's the reason why it does make sense, just epidemiology-wise, to avoid large crowds, and why businesses where people congregate in large groups are being closed down. So it all makes sense, but don't panic.
Thanks for introducing it, Don. And I've been following this line of thought for a while, and it relates to the transmission of the coronavirus. It is extremely infectious, and I think that's been puzzling people. And one of the theories that's starting to emerge is that the virus itself can travel in water vapor. And we usually would think of the sneeze or the cough as being the projector of that risk. But I believe it is just normal breathing. Also, if you go outside on a cold day, you'll see the amount of aspiration of water vapor that's occurring, reverse aspiration, so that's actually most quadrupeds and bipeds in the animal kingdom do the same thing. You'll see dogs panting, and if you bring dogs into a photographic studio, the lights will immediately start the process of panting, and the dog in the sunlight will do the same thing. So we're constantly trying to achieve this sort of equilibrium temperature-wise, and we do put a lot of water vapor into the air. Now, Don, what you said is good advice, is avoid office buildings and stay home. But the problem, the bad news, is that home for many people is a centrally heated duct system, and with using forced air and essentially recycling the air from one unit to another, which is why I think the virus detection rate in New York City will skyrocket. Today it's March 18th. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I did hear during the press conference that they're front running that effect, that there'll be a dramatic spike in the number of cases very shortly. I think Cuomo knows this too. His motives seem to be pretty pure with this thing, but I do notice a curiously large count numbers coming out of blue states, and I don't know if the rate of infection is that much different, but definitely there seems to be perhaps an ulterior motive in amping up that hysteria over the rate. But yeah, the point is that you'll see it more in areas where there is collective sharing of air. I'll just go into this a little more depth, and then we can go around the table. The atmospheric pressure rate is 14.7 psi. And the reason I bring that up is we don't notice it. Humans have an ability to produce, all animals produce a compensating interior pressure that pushes back at that same rate. So we achieve kind of an equilibrium. And we don't notice this, but we're really living in a sea of water vapor and gas. And it's preserved at 14.7 by the force of gravity. And that gravity also acts on water vapor. So essentially, that's why clouds don't just tumble to the earth. There's a compensating gravitational field that's pushing back on that water vapor. We can't feel it, so we don't sense it. And this is why this problem is going to be very hard for people to grasp psychologically. We see the sneeze, we can see a cough, we can hear the cough. It's more real to us. And this is kind of a silly example, but it was in one of my tweets. It's very similar to the cartoon SpongeBob, which anybody who had kids growing up about 10 or 20 years ago will probably knew what that was. So they had this undersea world where everybody was just sort of walking around. They were all, cartoon characters, but they were talking and conversing normally, and they were totally unaware of the water that they were living in. And it was obviously a nonsensical example. But it doesn't differ substantially from our world in some way. We live in a sea of gas and water vapor, pressurized at 14.7 psi. So that everything that we aspirate or exhale, the exhalation process contains a significant amount of water vapor that's just pushed out into the atmosphere and essentially taken in by anybody around us, or potentially in ductwork. I don't know. I mean, there's something, and this is why I come back to the militarization of this. This is a weaponized virus. I don't see it. It's got all the makings of a gas attack. I don't see how the humans could have survived if this was a normal process of nature for nature to dish out a virus of this sort. It was specifically tailored, in my opinion, to be very transmissible in water vapor, just in the same way that phosgene gas and all the other strategic bioweapons were designed. And this was cultured over a period of time under whatever circumstances, but it got out of the bag, and that's kind of where it's hitting us now. So the answer, I think some of the lessons of 1918's influenza epidemic, they actually did take people outdoors. They didn't know exactly why it worked, but it was sunlight and also a natural atmospheric astringent property that's present. And this is how humans have been living for thousands and thousands of years, outdoors. And this whole thing of living in these enclosed cages and working in offices, and we take that as normal, just like we take the SpongeBob pressurized air. We think this is normal. It's not. I don't know if the calling of humanity is to live and drive in cars and do all these things that, mass transit. All these things are being challenged. These paradigms of normality are being turned on their head and are being seen to potentially be completely toxic. And this may not be a very practical observation, yet I think we will probably be grasping and grappling with lifestyle issues as well, health issues, and we'll be reassessing, where do we want to live? How do we want to live? What is our path in life, be it not to survive in this soup of toxic substances that's suddenly invading our space and our breath. Our very essence of breathing is really one of the most life-giving things that we do on Earth. We don't beat our own heart, but we do definitely breathe consciously most of the time, but a lot of the time we don't even notice that we're breathing either. So we're going to be taking stock, I think, as a species and as spiritual beings looking harder at how does our behavior and how does our environment influence our ability to carry on the grand adventure of human beings on Earth.
Yeah, good thoughts, Ken. And one of the things that you're really alluding to there is large buildings and institutions, or such as retirement homes or hospitals. And I've known personally for a long time that hospitals are a dangerous place. I worked in one once, but I was in IT building, was in a separate building from the hospital, but so I didn't have to go over there much. But I've known that hospitals are dangerous germ breeding places for a long time, and have tried to stay away from them. But as far as institutions go, I happen to know that there is quite a range of how the HVA systems work in retirement homes. My father on the West Coast has his own control over his HVAC. He's got his own filter. He's got basically everything. He controls the climate in his unit, and other people do there as well. So it's not shared air. So that's not a universal thing. It may be more true on the West Coast that there is more individual control and less on the East Coast. That's certainly a possibility. I know in terms of general culture, that is probably also true, that those that are on the western side of the United States tend to have more personal space as a psychological dynamic. I know that's true. People on the East Coast in large population centers but they do stand closer to each other as a normal process. People on the West Coast are used to a larger distance, and I think that that's also true in the mountain states. And probably west of the Mississippi is the general line of demarcation. So with those, I think, and I hope that humanity, as Ken said, we're going to evaluate where we're going. I think we're all doing that at some level. And my inclination, my hope is that we, as a society, as a country, as a people, move towards more individual responsibility. And sometimes that might mean that dense population areas might have to get less dense, not through people dying, not through plagues or anything, but hopefully through a voluntary getting more space around you. And believe it or not, there actually is plenty of space in our country. We don't have to be densely packed. That's a choice that often is made for economic reasons, but if the economy changes, that might change also. So just some big thoughts there about those ideas that you raised, Ken.
I really like the idea of changing lifestyles, and Ken, what you said was really pretty moving. And this is, I think, an opportunity, as you both said, for everyone to reevaluate. And one thing that I think might be reevaluated is now that schools are closed, I know our grandsons are doing schoolwork at home, and I'm guessing many students are. If this program of doing schoolwork at home is successful, and I can't imagine that it wouldn't be, I will not be surprised if that is an ongoing trend. If people continue in the future to it's not exactly homeschooling. I mean, it can be integrated between homeschooling and learning online. And I think that it's a much more organic, natural way to learn. And I actually believe that it's very likely that some people who are working from home may continue to work from home. And if we historically look at how humanity has lived, this is historically the way that people have always lived. Families have been at home together, and I'm thinking mostly the context of agricultural communities. But historically, this was done even among artisans and others, that a family would live and work together and educate their children, and the children would help with the work of the family, whatever that happened to be. And there was a lifestyle that was more oriented around home and family. And I don't mean to just be completely old-fashioned or resist progress. But once again, that historically is how people have lived, and it has resulted in the progress that we've made to the point where we find ourselves today. And I think it's always been pretty unnatural for parents to go off to work and kids to go off to school. And I think that some of those paradigms are dissolving before our eyes. And I believe that, maybe businesses will realize that workers can be productive from home. Schools will realize that students can learn at home. And let's face it, how much money and stress and time would be saved if people didn't need to be transported to places to do all this. And many of the things, Ken, that you mentioned, the lifestyle of being outside and even, growing things, growing more of your own food and so on and so forth, people would have a lot more time and more resources to move toward that kind of a lifestyle. And I could see that being extremely beneficial for humanity on many levels.
It would take quite a while to unfold. Obviously, we would have to get through the speed bump here with the virus. But I think the trend began in Germany in the Prussian era, and they were, to raise that army, they had to get the children off the land and develop a common language, and many of the techniques and even the names of the institutions like kindergarten and some other things are based on the German model. And also same thing with production being centralized during the Industrial Revolution, way before there was even in any imagination the internet. There was this thing called work, and obviously you had the loom or the flour mill or wherever, that had to be centrally located. But we stuck to that, and we're still kind of, this is the sort of the sticky slowness of the change. We're still locked into that normalcy bias is having that. You go to work, and the U.S. has a little more land, and so we didn't develop probably luckily, we didn't develop a very strong central system to move people around. And then the advent of the automobile and corporate capitalism seemed to thrive by introducing this concept of the city, of the mass, the suburb, all these different ways of interacting with the land came into being. And still, it's not all of us see this, but when I see an ad, a lot of advertising will have a picture of a big city. It'll be we've probably all seen it. You'll see skyscrapers everywhere, and I've always looked at that as just a mistake to pack people in. It's such a vulnerable infrastructure, and sadly, we're seeing it now. How when you think about the amount of food that would need to be brought in, and there's not a plant in sight in a lot of these photographs. It's just these towering structures. And Don, getting back to your scenario with the separate controls, what worries me isn't the controls as much as where's the blower. It's kind of a practical issue. And in a lot of these buildings, they'll have one central forced air system, just to economize. And that's the risk I see. And I hope I'm wrong, really do. But again, we live in this sea. It's almost like water. It's the same thing. We can't feel it. We can't feel the air pressure, and we can't sense, we just think that a sneeze lands on the ground somehow, and it lands on a surface, and maybe it does. But a portion of that's just aspirated into the atmosphere and is kind of floating around. So that was, thanks for listening to that theory. We'll see how it develops, and we'll certainly come back to the bigger issues surrounding that once we're past this major challenge.
Well, thanks, Ken. One of the things that I want to really hammer again, and there's just a couple of tweets that I want to read with this in mind, so that, as people that are oriented around the psychology of humans, as this team is, we are basically calling out fear and saying that fear is dangerous, at least as dangerous, if not more so, than this virus itself. And there's a couple of tweets by Bill Mitchell that really made that very clear, and I'm just going to read those. He says 0.006% of China was infected. 0.002% of the U.S. is now infected. The models being used to frighten everyone are using 70 to 80% infection rates, levels which have never been reached in the history of disease. You're being played, America. Right on. And then the second one is, we are in again from Bill Mitchell, at Mitchell, VII. We are in a COVID-19 bubble, and as with most speculative bubbles, reality eventually catches up and the bubble collapses. Let's be real. 99% of the fear from COVID-19 comes from what we've been told it will do, will in quotes, because as pandemics go, what it has done, has in quotes, is unimpressive. Again, spot on. And what we want to do is give people a reason to not panic and realize that the panic is really out of control and is being exacerbated really irresponsibly by the mainstream media. But that doesn't mean that President Trump is not wise in taking the precautions that he has, because if he's right, and I believe that he is, Ken's been saying he believes it's a weaponized virus. I believe that too. And you definitely don't want to just blow this off as being just another version of the flu. Now, its numbers actually are along those lines, but it has characteristics that are more dangerous. I want to go back to the thing that I noticed about the media that I mentioned earlier, that we're actually getting less censorship now that we have a national emergency. These algorithms at Google are demonstrably different now. And there was a tweet by Jordan Sather that I'll highlight here. He said, "Holy trends, Batman. Look at that spike in hashtag QAnon searches right now. Some sort of major shift has taken place." And he shows a graph that shows a spike right now. And again, that's probably associated with the lifting of censorship. And it's also because people sort of intuitively know that there is something going on here that maybe is not being reported by the mainstream, and most Americans that have heard of QAnon think of that as being a so-called conspiracy theory or something kooky, but people are recognizing that something very momentous is going on, so people are searching out the QAnon stuff. And I'll point out that one of the most famous Q people that is known as Joe M. at Storm is Upon Us has a couple of really interesting tweets that I noticed this morning. And he says, "Hey, you out there, the ones that won't believe conspiracy theories unless Google says so, prepare to forget everything you thought you knew and embark on a fascinating new journey of discovery. Who owns the United States? Google it." And he's got the link. Actually, there's a link below. He's commenting on another tweet, and that other tweet shows a screenshot of that the owners of the United States are the Federal Reserve. And immediately when he said that, I thought of the very famous clip that many people have seen of George Carlin saying, "You have owners, and there's a big club, and you're not in it." And now we know that the name of the big club, and that whose owners Americans are, is known as the Federal Reserve. And if you're reading between the lines and listening to alternative news, you'll know or suspect that President Trump actually has a plan that's not being spoken openly yet, but I suspect it may be soon, a plan to change the whole Federal Reserve economic structure and make it so that it's not private and hidden the way it is now. So those things are now available to learn on the big search engine Google that was previously privatized, previously controlled by the private entity, but has been basically, because of the national emergency, become public during this time so that Americans can learn the truth and move in a more positive direction for the future. And that's what we're all talking about here, is what this future might look like. And I know Cindy probably has some thoughts about what I just shared.
Well, some of it is, what we discussed, which will probably be edited into a different video about returning to the land and people living more organically. And by that, I don't mean, we're all going to be hippies in dirty overalls. I believe that we've all been constrained to have aspects of our lives that are neither healthy nor productive. And one aspect of it that's kind of easy to latch onto as a concept is how women have been drawn into the workplace. And Ken mentioned a little bit about this with touching on Germany and kindergarten. It has served governments well. Well, I'll just say the U.S. It has served the U.S. government well to have women in the workplace. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is so that the government could step in and take over the education of the young. And I want to reiterate something that we've already touched on. Having students at home from school, and particularly college, gives parents an opportunity to discuss things with children in circumstances where, I'm referring to college students as children, grown children, they may be rocked a little bit, their worlds may be shaken, and instead of having a communist professor help them sort through it, they'll have their parents to help them sort through it. So having children in school serves a government because the government is able to program the children. So that's one aspect of women working. Another aspect of women working that serves governments well is simply the taxes. And some genius somewhere, probably with the IRS, sitting around a table smoking cigars, said, hey, guys, we could bring in more revenue if we got women to work. And we know from reports that the CIA was, in fact, involved in the feminist movement. And I'll try to get some links on that. But I think a lot of people in alternative media are already aware of that. And these are some of the things that have been behind getting women out of the home and into the workplace. Now, I personally believe that women can be very fruitful and productive in the home and have creative pursuits and even, accomplish many things, writing books, producing films, things of that nature. You can do that from your home, as many people on YouTube are proving now, including us. So there's that whole aspect. And, if you really go back far enough, and I touched on this before, men don't even need to go off to work. There are some things, when you have to produce goods, heavy industry, sure, that has historically, since the Industrial Revolution, has required men to work outside of the home. But as those kinds of undertakings tend to be more automated with robots and things of that nature, I think that even men will have more opportunities to work from home and maybe have more of a lifestyle that what Thomas Jefferson envisioned for Americans was that everybody would have a few acres of farmland and they would produce their own food, more or less. And then in the winter, when it was off season for working on the farm, people would have artistic and creative pursuits. And again, just a more organic type lifestyle, something that serves people and even communities better, certainly families. Thank you for listening to this presentation of Poli-Psych Podcast. We hope you have enjoyed this time. If you have, we ask that you please click like, subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our BitChute channel, certainly follow us on Twitter, and if you have a few moments, visit our website. Again, thanks for joining us, and until next time, take care.